Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 4 game from the New York International. Now, if you followed the round 3 video, you know that I drew another game with white playing down, and as I said in the last video, that was the last of me playing e4 because it really did not prove to be a very successful outing, and I kind of was trying to get back to some lines that I knew a little bit better. And in this one with black, I wanted to be a little bit more alert and at least get a more challenging position out of the opening. My opponent in this one was none other than FIDE master Rawle Allicock, and he's actually originally from England, but has been living in the States for many years now. I believe as a full-time chess instructor, and he's a really nice guy. So if you ever see him around, he's just a good guy to talk to about chess and things in general. He's a pretty decent dude. Anyways, I had played him once or twice before, I believe, and I think I'd won our previous matchups. But, you never take anything for granted, so I was expecting a real tussle in this one, especially because I'd already, conceded 2 draws to opponents lower rated than me. So in any case, I was black in this one, and let's get into it. So Rawle opened with d4. And I played d5, and after c4, e6, have somewhat of the beginnings of a Queen's Gambit decline structure. And then after knight f3, I actually went a6. And this line with a6 is, something that I've actually played before, but is something that's been popular now as a popular sideline of the Queen's Gambit decline for about 2 years now. I believe Carlsen really brought it to prominence a little bit when he played it several times in rapid events in 2017. And since then, the line has, taken on a bit of a life of its own, and many players have seen it as a nice alternative to get a dynamic position early on. The point is that if white wants to play fairly tame setup with knight c3 or g3 going for Cataclon or something like that, black's actually threatening to take this pawn and reinforce with b5 and just remain a pawn up. And so a6 actually does have a threat, an indirect threat of capturing on c4 and reinforcing the extra pawn that is won. So because of that, white can actually decide to make it a real gambit and not defend the pawn, or to exchange on d5. And most people actually exchange on d5, and this is actually what my opponent did here. And after e takes d5, white's argument is that he's actually a tempo up on Queen's Gambit exchange variation lines because, instead of a knight being on f6, a pawn is on a6. Now, black, on the other hand, argues that essentially this a6 move is actually a useful move because it is a good prophylaxis against a minority attack that eventually tends to come with b4 and b5. Typically, black eventually puts his pawn on c6, and b4, b5 can undermine that chain. And in some lines, it discourages a knight c3, knight b5 maneuver, or just any piece to b5 that can harass black under the setup that the black player tends to assume in these types of structures. So basically, you can judge, which side of the position you prefer, but these are basically which each side is arguing for in this setup. So anyways, after e takes d5, white went knight c3, which is the main move here. And now, obviously, white has 2 pieces developed, and I have none, so black follows up very quickly with knight f6. And then bishop g5 comes, and this is essentially the one of the points is that now white has this lead in development, this annoying pin. And black actually follows up here 95% of the time with bishop e6, and this is the move that I played. And the setup here is a little bit different than traditional Queen's Gambit exchange variations because now that the pawn is on a6, black actually takes some liberties to set up his bishops in a different formation. So one bishop goes to e6, and after e3 and knight bd7, you can see that typically this bishop is on c8 in these structures, but now in e6, it's actually reinforcing the d5 pawn and is on a slightly more active post from which the rooks have a better chance at getting connected sooner. So that's the idea, is you put the bishop on e6 first and then the knight on d7, and everything is relatively secure. And after knight bd7 and bishop d3, which was played, black now plays bishop d6. And this is the key kind of nuance in this line, in these a6 lines, is one bishop goes to e6, one goes to d6, and the argument is that essentially these bishops are more actively placed than is typically the case in these exchange variation lines. Normally, the dark square bishop is on e7, and the other one, the light square bishop, is usually on c8, and you can see here they're both on the third rank, so a little bit of a different thing. So after bishop d6, white actually played bishop h4 now, and this is actually a new move for me. I may have faced it once in 2018, but I can't completely recall. It's a very original move, and not normally what is played in this position. Now, I was trying to figure out why bishop h4, why moving it to h4, kind of wasting a tempo unprompted. I didn't play h6, so why push it back there voluntarily? Well, I think there are two reasons, but the main reason is that this knight now is actually threatening the bishop on e6. So if knight g5 comes, my bishop can't go backward now on that diagonal, and the f5 square is covered, and the g4 square might be a little bit awkward if white can harass me again with f3 or something like that. So I think the threat here is actually knight g5 to just cause a crisis to my bishop on e6. And I respected that move enough that I thought, well, maybe should I play h6? Should I not play h6? I wound up playing h6. I thought that knight g5 was a significant enough idea that I really do want to preserve this bishop on e6, don't want to trade it for the knight, and compromise my structure with f takes e6, so I thought this was sensible. After h6, white actually went bishop g3, and I think this is the second piece of his idea, is that from g3 he actually gets to exchange my my bishop on d6, that active dark square bishop, so to speak. But some lines even gets to open the h file. Now, I wasn't super impressed with this maneuver because I think, as a general rule in these structures, normally black is actually trying to trade those dark squared bishops to alleviate some of the tension in the middle of the board. So there's some lines of the Queen's Gambit exchange where this bishop is on e7 and this bishop is still on g5, and after h6, bishop h4, black actually goes knight h5 to try to trade these bishops on h4 and e7. So the fact that black is kind of the fact that white is voluntarily moving towards this maneuver didn't seem so dangerous to me, and I was quite comfortable with it. So I actually took on g3. And after h takes g3, of course, white does have this, half-open file for his rook on h1, but in general, I'm not very impressed with this pawn structure for white. It's incredibly immobile. So basically, in many lines of the Queen's Gambit exchange, one of the main plans is to play the Botvinnik plan, which is basically a space grab in the center where white goes pawn f3 and ultimately e4, and tries to get a nice, essentially tries to roll black in the center with e5 and get like a nice pawn center. And now with h takes g3, it's very difficult to accomplish the f3 and e4 plan because the g3 pawn is constantly a target. And it's just the structure is actually quite weak. And there are actually some lines where if white castles, the knight on g4 is extremely well placed because it stops the f pawn from moving because e3 is hanging. And even in some lines, if the king is on g1, it actually has back rank problems because the knight is also covering the h2 square. When I got my first Grandmaster norm in 2018, the game that actually got me the norm, that my first GM norm, was actually a structure very similar to this for white, where I actually had a knight on g4 and delivered a mating attack on the back rank because the king was extremely weak. And it's kind of funny because it didn't actually come out of a Queen's Gambit exchange variation specifically, but the structure was the same, and white's pawns there kind of struggled. So here I think white's really playing very short term with the structure because he's basically arguing that in the short term the h file may discourage black from castling to that side because the rook has might be a threat. Maybe there's some g4, g5 ideas at some juncture. I respected it enough that I decided not to castle right away and kind of try to see what black's intentions were. So I actually went queen e7. Although it should be pointed out that castling right away is actually totally playable because there's no real sacrifice in h6 right now. I can just recapture with the g-pawn. And g4, g5, which is the lever white would want to play to take advantage of this hook on h6, can just be, is bottled up and captured quite easily by either one of black's minor pieces, either the knight on f6 or the bishop on e6. So I'm not really buying the structure right now, although at first sight it could look kind of menacing to castle into an open file like this. So that's why I decided to wait just a little bit longer with queen e7 to kind of see what white was trying to do. So after queen e7, white actually went a3, and I think that's a kind of a waiting move, kind of suggesting to me, well, you know what, I kind of want to see what you're going to do, black. Are you going to castle kingside? Because that'll tell me what I need to do. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the gist of the idea. In some lines, maybe it also facilitates b4, b5 in this minority attack that we talked about before. But again, this pawn on a6 is actually really useful at kind of just slowing down that minority attack. And the other thing about it, and the reason why a3 isn't super useful if that's what you actually want to do, is because in order to play b4 and b5 and to get that break in, you actually want to recapture with the a pawn on b5. Because if you don't, after I play a takes b5 and you recapture with a piece, I can go c6, and the a3 pawn will be extremely weak because my rook on a8 and my queen on e7 will be bearing down on that pawn. So you really want to go a4 and to go b4, b5 if that's what you're trying to do. But in order to execute that, you actually need to go rook b1 first, right? And then b4, and then usually knight a4, knight c5 is something you want to do first before even playing a4, because if you play b5 and your knight is on c3, typically it doesn't have a good way to get into the action. So essentially the point is that a3 doesn't actually advance a minority attack initiative. And so because of that, it's not really something that's quite serious in this position. So anyways, I probably should have taken this a little bit more into account, and I didn't. So I actually decided to play castles. I mean, an argument could be made that I can try to improve the position with c5 and to break open, but I thought castles was fine. And I didn't seriously, I wasn't seriously concerned about a minority attack, but I did think it was a distinct possibility. Looking back on it now, it's extremely unrealistic that that would even be a move here to play for b4 because you weaken your entire queenside. So anyways, after castles, white actually went rook c1. And again, he's kind of making these almost waiting moves on the queen side and not clarifying the position of his king. I actually decided to play rook fe8 here, which is, in general, a very good, a typical move in the structure to get the rook to the half-open file. Typically, the rook winds up on e8, so I thought it was a good waiting move to kind of see what white was trying to do. An argument could be made for just playing c5 as well and just trying to play actively in the middle given the king is still on e1. But I was reluctant to play positions where white essentially has the d4 square firmly under lock and key and I have this isolated pawn. But even these positions are completely fine for black. I just didn't want to unnecessarily create an isolated pawn if I didn't have to. So that's why I went rook fe8. After rook fe8, white actually went bishop b1, and now I finally get a key, basically, indicator of what white's been trying to do in the last few moves, because this is something that now started to make sense to me. With bishop b1, he tucked his... first of all, he played rook c1 and tucked his bishop, away. He allowed the rook to get into the game first before playing bishop b1, so the rook wasn't under lock and key on a1. So now rook c1 makes sense to me. And now with bishop b1, he is entertaining a queen d3, aiming at h7 type of battery. So, that also makes sense to me. And maybe in some lines... with this a3 move, maybe he's arguing that in some lines he could pop out to a2 and actually challenge the d5 pawn that way. So if I do go for c5 and give myself that isolated pawn, maybe it can be a target from the a2 square. So all of a sudden, bishop e1 kind of clarified some things for me. He's delaying castling to try and get some initiative on the king side, particularly against my king. Now, I wasn't really buying that this was going to actually work. Part of the things with rook fe8 was that it actually sometimes entertains the idea of knight f8, which gives me additional coverage against the against a queen h7 checkmate idea. So I really did not think this was actually gonna work. And my thought process was, if I just kind of play normal sensible moves and defend this initiative for a little bit, he's going to have to castle or seriously compromise his position to keep the initiative going. So because of that rationale, after bishop e1, I just played c6. And my idea was keep the pawn structure solid, don't give him any targets, and just let him continue to play aggressive moves that maybe keep his king in the center, because if he does this long enough, he's going to create more problems than solutions. So given that dynamic, I thought, okay, I just need to keep my positional integrity intact. And c6 does that. It's prophylaxis. It covers the c7 pawn, which was maybe a target, and just deals with that any counterplay on the c file prophylactically. So after c6, white now went queen c2. Makes some sense, and at least it's consistent with his previous ideas to line the queen up against the h7 square. And now I actually went bishop g4. And my idea here was, now that I have my rook on e8, my queen on e7, I really wanted to line it up against the king. And now I discouraged the move knight e5. In the previous position before bishop g4, if I played a move like rook b8, knight e5 might be an idea. And the point is that if I take on e5, that would be ill-advised, because now my knight would actually be challenged to move, and that knight is guarding the all-important h7 square. And note that if I go knight e4, after knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes e4, I still have this problem. And of course, g6 just hangs the pawn on h6. So just didn't want to allow that type of counterplay. And so the nice thing about playing bishop g4, instead of, this dummy move rook a b8 that I was just kind of showing you as an example, is now if knight e5 is played, I can actually recapture multiple times on e5 and keep my other knight on f6. So I really like this one. After bishop g4, I think Rawle actually kind of really went for it, because he went for the move rook h4. And this was frankly a move I was always kind of looking at and considering and almost sitting on, because I thought there was some future in this potential idea. The point is that from rook h4 in some positions, you could use the g-pawn finally as a lever because it's covered by the rook. So, for instance, let's say my bishop was not on g4. Let's say, again, I went rook a b8. Now if rook h4, then rook a8. Now g4 is actually a potential move, because I can't take twice on g4 because of the mate it on h8. So given that dynamic, I actually did see rook h4 as a way to kind of, push the g-pawn and use it as a lever. But now, after I've occupied the square with bishop g4 and rook h4, I actually thought it'd be nice to cement that bishop there, and I decided to do that with the move h5. And this was actually my idea with playing bishop g4, actually, was that if the h-pawn moves, now my bishop kind of locks the rook in on h4, and I thought white would be seriously worse now, because this king is now on e1, cannot castle, and this attack kind of slows down, because my next move will be g6. And the point is, now that I played h5, when I play g6, the h-pawn isn't even a target. And so if I'm able to set up this h5, g6, f7 pawn structure, I thought this bishop on b1 is kind of locked out of the game. The queen on c2 would be misplaced, and I'd probably be better. And after h5, Rawle actually went rook h1 back, kind of acknowledging that the plan just didn't really work. Again, I want to point out that if a move like knight h2 is played, challenging the bishop on g4, and again threatening that like knight takes g4, rook takes g4, knight takes g4, queen h7 mate stuff, and then queen h8, I actually would still just play g6 here, and then this diagonal is just shut down, and after knight takes g4, I could just play knight takes, no harm, no foul. Important to note here too that if rook takes h5, which seems like a really enticing, promising tactic, I thought there were a few ideas here. One I thought might even work is knight takes f2. There are some positions where I thought this type of move would be really nice, point being that I get a lot of pawns for the piece, and even something like rook e6, all of a sudden rook f6 becomes a serious threat. So I basically thought that black was doing pretty well here in scenarios that knight takes g4 is played. And I can also play h takes g4. Maybe that's even safer. And then go king g7 and rook h8 and actually challenge for the h file. So, yeah, I thought I was in good shape. So to see rook h1, I felt pretty pleased. After rook h1, I went g6, just shutting that diagonal down. And it's kind of funny because this king on e1 and rook on h1 are in the places where they seem ready to castle, but the rook is already moved twice, so he can't castle, and this gives me a huge opportunity to kind of play through the middle and take advantage of the king being stuck in the middle for now. To me, it seemed like white would need to play king f1 and king g1 to just get out of the way of this mayhem in the center that could potentially happen if I open up the position. After g6, white went queen b3, challenging my pawn on b5, and essentially kind of shifting gears and trying to find a new plan, new targets. But I think as long as his king is on e1, it's kind of a risky proposition. Here, I should have been a little bit more alert to the fact that white can't castle. And maybe I was kind of like Jedi mind tricked to a certain extent because the pieces are in the right position to castle, but they can't. Because I actually decided to play kind of not in the most principled way. And after queen b3, I actually went b5, just radically pushing this pawn up the board to defend it. But that wasn't entirely necessary. And the issue with playing b5 is that now the c pawn is kind of a backward pawn and a target for the white rook. Now, again, I didn't think this would be a major problem because I thought that, if my knight comes to c4, there isn't any real issue with the c6 pawn. But even so, the fact that this b2 pawn is still on b2 instead of b4 means that if my knight gets to c4, it can actually be challenged by playing b3. And so typically as black, in the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, you don't necessarily want to go b5 unless white has gone b4 because it means that you can't actually, really shield your backward pawn permanently if the knight can be challenged by a pawn. So instead, there were better moves, and one of the moves that is actually much better is actually just rook a8. And the reason rook a8 is so good is because in some lines you're actually just entertaining c5, and if you play c5 and your rook is on the open file ready to contest on c1. There is really legitimate pressure because this king is stuck on e1. And one of the main points of rook a8 is that if white tries to get greedy and play queen takes b7, I actually just have rook c b8. And the point is that white can take a second pawn, but after rook takes b2, the position is pretty much lost because this king is on e1. This rook is too active on the second rank, and I will crash through here, whether it's like rook takes f2 and queen takes e3 check, and then collecting the rook on c1, or maybe it's queen takes a3, or maybe it's a well-timed rook e b8. The fact of the matter is this king on e1 is kind of a sitting duck, and it shouldn't bode well for white's chances. So really rook a8 was much better, and I did not have to play b5 and give myself that backward pawn. Instead, I did do that, and after b5, white now went king f1, which is a good bit of prophylaxis, getting the king off the line of my queen and rook. And now in some lines, white will be able to entertain a move away with the knight, opening up the rook to the c6 pawn. Now, I was kind of alert to this. I mean, I didn't want to allow the c6 pawn to be a target, so I actually went knight b6, kind of keying up my knight to go to c4. But now white actually went queen b4, and in this position, I actually kind of panicked. Now, the reason I panicked is because I thought getting some endgame with queen takes b4 would maybe be a little bit unpleasant for me. I thought there's certain scenarios where now the c6 pawn is a permanent target that can't really be liberated, because the d4 and b4 pawns are clamping down on that square. And again, I thought with the knight coming to c4, there's just b3 move, and my knight has to be kicked away. And I was afraid that my structure might be a problem. Now, the thing that I kind of underestimated is I don't have to take on b4. And with the knight coming to c4 and not trading on b4, if b3 is played, the a3 pawn is actually hanging. So there's nothing to fear, because if I'm able to play knight takes a3 and be up a pawn, and then in some lines I could play knight takes b1, surely I would have more than enough play for a backward pawn, and this wouldn't be a problem at all. But because I was worried about queen b4 and this queen trade all of a sudden, I actually made some really irrational decisions, and they actually threw away all of my advantage. The first irrational decision I made, well, actually, before I get into my decision, just to flesh out the knight c4 line a little bit further, let's say knight c4 is played, right? Now I'm actually in some lines threatening to take on b4 and then take on b2. And like I said, b3, knight takes a3 is a move. So let's say queen takes e7 was played. And after rook takes e7, knight d1, right, is played, protecting the pawn on b2. I think this is a line I looked at and was like, I don't know about this. Isn't b3 going to happen now? Well, no, actually, now I can actually just play knight e4. And all of a sudden here, black's actually almost winning, because I have several threats. One is actually, in some lines, knight d2 check. In some lines, I can play a5 and a4 and cement my knight here. And again, the knight on c4 can't really be effectively dislodged because the a3 pawn is hanging. And you can't follow up with rook takes c6 because the b1 bishop would be hanging. So white's kind of tied down. And after knight e4, if bishop takes e4 is played, I can take with the d pawn. And if the knight goes backwards to e1, I could just take on d1 and then take on b2 at tempo and then come back to c4. And I'm a pawn up with a much better structure and much more active pieces. Again, this rook on h1 is kind of cut out of the game right now. So, yeah, this would just be totally the way to go. And, yeah, black essentially has no problems here. And then if knight e5 is played, trying to, give up the d pawn for the pawn on c6, well, that actually doesn't work either, because after knight takes e5, d takes e5, and rook d8, this knight on d1 is hit multiple times, and the king is also cut on the back rank, and after knight c3, I can just go rook takes e5, and I'm essentially a pawn up. I have control of the one open file, and now with the bishop on g4, it is extremely difficult for the white rooks to actually get connected, and just for this king to get off the first rank. So this position would just be lost. Rook d2 here is a serious threat, for instance. So, yeah, there were not enough resources for white here to really, panic. But panic is what I did, and after queen b4, I actually went bishop takes f3, which is a terrible move. Now, the idea with bishop takes f3 was essentially to stop knight e5 ideas. I think in some lines I was wary of endgames where I take on b4 or put my knight on c4, but then knight e5 comes and challenges my knight on c4. The issue with this move is that I actually accelerate the opportunity for white's rooks to get connected. With this bishop on g4, the king was in a rock and a hard place. It couldn't go to g2. It had to make multiple moves to get connected. And again, even on h2, it wouldn't have been fully secure because, as I mentioned earlier in the game, there's always these knight g4 check ideas. But by actually trading on f3, what I do is not only do I give the king easy access to g2, opportunity to connect the rooks, I also take away squares in the center for my knight to jump to. So all of a sudden, white's pawn structure is actually quite decent, and my knight on f6 is struggling to get active. Huge, huge mistake, and basically changes the evaluation of the position from being quite a bit better for me to being very close to equal. After g takes f3, I actually now made my second huge mistake, and it was the move queen d8. And again, this move actually makes no sense in conjunction with my previous move, because bishop takes f3 in part was to actually make sure my knight was unassailable on c4. But I think, unfortunately, what kind of got me in a panic state is I thought that after knight c4, queen takes e7, rook takes e7, and knight e2, that my knight would be a little bit unstable here, and in some lines, I'd be trading the b2 pawn for the c6 pawn, and I didn't like the prospect of my d5 pawn being kind of isolated and weak afterward. But even in this position, black is the one that should be playing for something, because I can go rook c7 and protect the c pawn, and rook c2 pretty much needs to be played to cover the b2 pawn, and I can go a5. And basically, if I'm able to get an a4, my knight on c4 will be cemented on that square, won't be easy to challenge. And if the white bishop takes on c4, I'll play b takes c4 and get a half-open b file for my my rooks. So really, like, my whole point with bishop takes f3 was to play knight c4, and then I decide not to do it anyway because I don't want to trade queens. That was a poor choice. So so queen d8 was a really bad move. And for the moment, actually, I moved to a square where my pieces, my rooks in particular, are not connected, which is a problem. So really bad move, really bad sequence of moves. Bishop takes f3 and queen d8. After queen d8, white now went knight e2, and now it's white that actually is taking over the initiative. The c6 pawn is now a target. My rooks are not connected, and my knight on f6 is kind of dominated. And all of a sudden, this bishop on b1 might have some tactical opportunities with this knight shifting over to f4, both hitting that critical square on g6. And yeah, I'm actually not in good shape anymore, sadly. I went a5 now, challenging the queen on b4. I think that was my idea with playing queen b8, is that I wouldn't allow the queen to stay on this diagonal forever. And after a5, white went queen c3, which is very logical. I'm still targeting the c6 pawn. And now I went knight c4. But man, I wasted a lot of time trying to make that move work and harm my position in to make it work. So not a good choice. After knight c4, white actually went knight f4. And again, the g6 pawn is protected, but it is kind of a soft point for sacrifices now, because both the bishop and knight are pointing at it, and yeah, my king could potentially be naked. And if white follows up with king g2 shortly, white has a great position. I now panicked further. I mean, I recognized that I kind of mucked it up, and I wanted to, at least, I didn't want to play solid anymore. I wanted to play kind of crazy and dynamic, because another thing that worried me was knight d3, knight c5 maneuver. And from c5, I thought the knight was really well placed, kind of, takes advantage of my weaknesses in my position. And so I thought I need to try and make something happen, and now it's actually forcing the issue with the move b4. Now, more logical would just be a4. We talked about this, right? Playing a4, cementing the knight on c4. Now b3 is not advisable because I just take, and the a3 pawn would be a weakness. And sure, white can play knight d3 and get to c5. But actually, I can kind of play around the knight on c5. Like, it's not actually hitting anything super important. So actually, if knight d3, I can just go king g7. And I can sometimes just play on the e file, like rook a7, rook e7, sometimes rook h8 and h4, and just kind of ignore the knight there and make sure I don't get in the way of any nasty forks. I think sometimes with king g7, there's a little bit of risk of the queen being tactically exposed on that diagonal. So, for instance, if an e4 pawn stack happens, sometimes there's like d takes e4, d5 breakthroughs. But I have so many pieces on the e4 square right now that the break is not very likely. So yeah, this would have been a better way to go. Instead, I went b4, trying to open up the queen side, but actually this does more harm than good, and it's just it's not well timed. A takes b4 is played, and I played a takes b4. And white actually went queen e1, which was not necessary. I can understand why I was kind of concerned about taking the pawn, but in fact, if queen takes b4 and then rook b8, now queen e1 is just totally satisfactory. And after rook takes b2, knight d3, my rook actually doesn't have the privilege of staying on the second rank for too long, and I pretty much have to back up. And frankly, white's in really good shape now. Sure, the knight can't be, challenged with the b pawn gone, but it's also not so hot, and at some point it actually might be challenged. Like maybe there's a knight e5 idea, maybe there's e4 at some point, undermining the knight on c4. The point is that once white gets in king g2 and consolidates, my structure is actually worse than white's. So that's the huge problem here. Now, if this pawn on c6 was on e6, totally different story. Then my structure would be quite decent. But this backward pawn on c6 is a problem, and then d5 is in turn a problem if the c6 pawn actually drops. So totally unnecessary to kind of move away and not take that pawn on b4. But queen e1 is fair enough, and I'm still worse here. I mean, this knight can now come to d3, target b4, get in knight c5, and again, king g2 is an option. And with queen e1, I decide that knight takes b2 would make my knight kind of stranded, and it would hang the c6 pawn. So I actually decided to play queen d6. And my idea here was to defend the c6 pawn and reinforce the threat of knight takes b2. Now, a better move would have actually just been b3. And the point is that I'm actually cementing my knight on c4, not allowing white to play b3. And then in some lines, maybe this b3 pawn becomes a little dangerous if white ignores it. For instance, if rook c3, challenging the b3 pawn now, rook b8, if this pawn on b3 stays on the board and I somehow take b2, all of a sudden then my b pawn becomes the strongest pawn on the board and a serious factor. But rook c3 is not the best move. Instead, again, king g2 would be sufficient, and white has a pretty significant advantage here. Again, note that if knight takes b2 now, I think rook takes c6 is very satisfactory. And after knight c4, something like queen c3, or excuse me, even knight takes d5 here, because now the knight on c4 is loose. So, yeah, there's just quite a few opportunities. Note that if queen takes d5, rook takes f6 is a nice move. So yeah, there's some resource in the position tactically as well, with the knight being a little bit sensitive on c4. So anyways, after queen d6, white now played queen e2, protecting the b2 pawn, and I think it's actually a decent move because you also keep the queen 2 diagonals away from the knight. And I talk about this quite a bit, that when you are dealing with knights, you're playing against them rather. Keeping your pieces 2 diagonals away means that it takes 3 moves for the knight to actually attack you. So, if you're a queen or you're a bishop or really any piece, it's nice to have that comfort that the queen can't, that the knight can't geometrically challenge you for a few moves. So anyways, after queen e2, I went b3 now, deciding that, yeah, I don't want to allow b3, and I'm going to cement my pawn on b3. And now white went bishop d3, and this is essentially the other strength with the queen e2 move that Rawle played a move ago, was that now the knight on c4 is a really serious target and not stable there. And you can see there are just 3 attackers now and 1 defender, so I can't even begin to protect it right now. And because of that, I actually just have to move away. And again, if my knight moves away from the c4 square, then my backward pawn is not really shielded effectively anymore and becomes a target. And you can just see how my pawns here on the queen side are really potential targets. So this really hurts me in my defense. After knight b6, white went rook c3, which is a fully effective move, attacking b3. But again, for like the 4th or 5th time, king g2 would have been more logical, just to play that very quickly, get the rooks connected, because then you can even consider challenging on the a file. But rook c3 is also fine. And after rook c3, I went knight a4 now, at least trying to get some activity for the b3 pawn, which I thought would be a lost pawn. And after rook takes b3, I actually went c5. And my idea here is that I need to try and get some counterplay before white actually gets king g2 in. So I thought the best way to do that would be to liberate my backward pawn with tempo and threaten some ideas, maybe c4 and stuff like that. White now went bishop b5, and frankly, I saw this move, and it's quite effective, but White actually had a winning move in this position. c5 was actually a losing move, and the reason for it was actually quite a remarkable tactic. So why don't you pause the video from this position after c5 and try to figure out White to play and win. And you need to find, it's a line that has multiple moves, so you find the first 2 or 3 moves, you pretty much get the idea. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try and figure out what the move was for White. The move that won the game for White was actually bishop takes g6. And I alluded earlier to this theme of the knight and the bishop when it was on b1 lining up against this g6 pawn and being right for sacrifices. But the interesting thing about this sacrifice, and I think the reason it's not the easiest thing in the world to see, is because after f takes g6, you actually don't recapture with the knight, but you actually play the move queen c2. And the idea is you actually want to recapture on g6 with the queen. And this actually is a serious problem, because if the pawn on g6 drops, then the h5 pawn drops soon thereafter, and then the rook actually activates on the h file and doesn't need to activate via the center. So this is actually a huge problem, and after queen c2, I pretty much have to guard that pawn with the queen so that the queen doesn't invade. But now we see the idea with queen c2 is a double attack, because I don't have to take on g6 right away. Instead, White can actually play rook a3. And now the issue is that not only is the pawn on g6 still under fire, but now the knight on a4 is hanging, and retreating to b6 doesn't really work because there's d takes c5 in a lot of positions. So yeah, it's just a ton of problems essentially with the line. So for instance, if say knight b6, let's say b takes c5 now, the queen is hit. I pretty much would be obliged to play, I think, rook a c8, because if you play rook e c8, then there's rook takes a8 first, and if rook takes, c takes d6, and knight takes is extremely ugly, and I don't think it actually works. But basically, because of these themes with rook a3 and knight b6, d takes c5, Black would actually need to play c takes d4. And after c takes d4, rook takes a8, or excuse me, rook takes a4, d takes e3. Black's trying to get a few pawns for the piece, but after this trade on a8 and then f takes e3, it's actually that White that's actually winning. Even though he's only a pawn up right now, g6 is a weakness, d5 is a weakness, and the rook can get into the game via the first or second rank quite quickly. So, for instance, if king g7, king g2, the rook comes to d1, and White will win a second pawn. So, unfortunately, the position is just lost if bishop g6 and queen g2 is found. Instead, after c5, White did play bishop b5, and this breathed a little bit of life into the position because I'm not losing immediately. But I actually was a little bit frustrated to have my pieces skewered like this, because it meant that my knight on a4, that was more or less my most active piece, was going to get traded off. So I went rook e c8 now, at least trying to bring my rook to a file that was going to be opened. And now White actually went bishop takes a4, trading on a4 right away. But a better move would have actually just been rook a3. And the point is, again, this knight on a4 is actually really poorly placed. And, can't actually go forward. So I'd actually have to bring it back. And this would actually give White really convenient exchanges that actually, make my pieces less coordinated. So you can see this version of the position is much better for White, just from the standpoint that this knight is on a8. The rook is now ready to come to the game on d1. And I still pretty much have this target on d5 that's still an issue. Whereas in the position with bishop takes a4 right away, at least after rook takes a4, my rooks are kind of active. Now, White is still massively better, and my position is hanging by a thread. But after d takes e5 and rook takes e5, at least my rooks are kind of active. So anyways, from here, White actually played king g2. And my position, I recognized, was almost in shambles. I mean, I'm a pawn down now, right? White just has an extra B pawn, and White's king is actually more snug looking than mine. And this rook is going to come to d1 and now hammer away my isolated pawn. And so I thought, I really need to just make some last-ditch effort to get some counterplay, or I was going to lose. Because defending my weaknesses wouldn't be sufficient anymore. Because, to put it simply, they're indefensible. They're too difficult to defend. So with that knowledge, I thought, okay, I need to try and drum up some chances, even if they're not particularly, good. I need to try and create something. And I recognized that my opponent here was actually quite low on time, and my real shot was going to be to actually, put him in a position where he has to make a few more difficult decisions before the time control. So after King G2, I actually went Rook A C4. And again, this is actually not the best move in the position. A better move would actually have been King G7, just, stepping out of a potential check on the back rank, overprotecting the G6 pawn, which we identified was a tactical soft spot. Yeah, that would have been the more prudent, safer move. But quite frankly, if the rook comes to d1 unscathed and trains down on the d5 pawn, I'm not going to be able to defend this. Like, e4 is a potential threat, taking advantage of this pin of the queen on d6. The rook's doubling on the d file. It's just not something I believed I would hold. So I decided to say, you know what, I'm going to, kind of go all in with a plan that probably shouldn't work, but at least tries to get some counterplay. And you can see here my idea is just rook c2. After rook c4, white played rook d1, and this is actually not the best move. It's actually a serious mistake. Instead, the move queen d3 would have been much better. And the point is that now you're actually threatening this knight takes g6 ideas. And after king g1, you actually go rook b7 and reinforce queen takes g6 as an idea. Because now I can't recapture on g6 with f-pawn because of the pin. And so this rook b7 move would actually force a trade of rooks with rook c7. And after this trade on c7, like, white has pretty much gotten the extinguisher out, the fire extinguisher out, because he's basically extinguishing my initiative. Now that one pair of rooks is off the board, now the knight can relocate and consolidate, and then the rook can eventually come to d1 and win the game. So very, very important to actually, kind of extinguish my initiative with queen d3 and rook b7, but not easy to see if you didn't see this tactical idea with taking on g6. And from the course of the game, it was quite clear that whether it's bishop g6 earlier, or whether it's queen c2 or queen d3 now, sacking on g6 was not something I think he strongly considered. So anyways, after rook d1, now I actually get in this move g5, and this is huge because now that I got in g5, I'm actually able to destabilize the knight a little bit, and combined with rook c2, I get a little bit of counterplay. Note that now my pawn on d5 can't be captured because, I can just take back and win a piece. So if knight takes d5, rook takes d5, no harm, no foul. If queen c4, rook d1. And now that this knight is destabilized just a little bit, it gives me some chances. So, I know g5 looks like a very wild-looking move, pushing the pawns in front of your king, but I had to be as active as possible, given that I didn't want the slow death, because that would be painful and difficult. So after g5, white now went knight d3, retreating that knight, and this is a happy sign for me because now the rook is not trained on the d5 pawn anymore. And now I actually played rook 5 c8, or I guess I played rook c8. You don't have to say the number because there's only one rook that could go to c8 here. But after rook c8 now, my rooks are still connected. I still have two heavy pieces on the board. Some lines I might be entertaining rook c2, but I've just broken the coordination of white's pieces temporarily, where it's kind of more of a mess than before. And in some lines, I am actually entertaining h4, g4 to rip open this wall of pawns that's really doing a great job of shielding the king presently. So after rook c8, white actually went f4, trying to actually take advantage of my pawn being advanced. But this is actually another mistake, because this actually does more harm than foul. Now opening up this diagonal, the h1a8 diagonal, to the white king, and just weakening also the g4 and e4 squares for the knight. So f4 is actually kind of ill-advised. Instead, rook b4 would have been way more sensible. And the point, just like in previous lines, is that you just try to trade a pair of rooks before trying to go forward, because it's really my rooks that are my last kind of saving grace in terms of counterplay in this position. So if you trade one of them, it alleviates the conversion task significantly and makes my defending task really difficult. But instead, f4 is played, and this was a welcome sight, because now after f4, I actually went rook c2. And rook c2 now is actually based upon the fact that after rook d2, which was played and forced, I actually can take on d2 and go d4. Note that if the queen moves, let's say to f1, now knight e4 is a move, or knight g4 even. And you can see here that the f2 pawn is sensitive, but also the e3 pawn is sensitive because of this pin. So really, this f4 move was really ill-advised. And after rook c2, rook d2, I took on d2, and after queen takes, played d4. And all of a sudden, it's a total mess, because now queen d5 check is a threat picking up the rook. Now there's an annoying pawn tension with d takes e3 that opens up another line for my queen. My knight on f6 is eyeing g4 and e4 still. And I have enough counterplay to actually survive this game, amazingly. After d4, too, you can see that my rook on c8 is actually more active than this rook on b3. This rook on b3 can't transfer over and trade itself anymore, and that's a problem. After d4, white went queen a5, trying to essentially just stop the queen d5 check idea. The computers actually prefer the move rook a3 slightly to queen a5, but in both lines, believe it or not, black is actually no longer losing. And black can actually get enough counterplay here to hold, because there are these annoying pawn tensions and trades that allow black's pieces to enter. But queen a5 actually was a move that was played with basically a few seconds left on my opponent's clock. And though we were playing with increment, I kind of recognized here that I drummed up enough counterplay where things were not as clear anymore. And it was because of that I actually entertained the notion of winning the game. Now, this is not a winning position. Queen takes g5 is a serious threat, and I don't have any winning attack, but I thought that if I created just enough confusion here, I could win the game with him being on just seconds. And because of that, I actually did not play the most sensible move. The best move and the most sensible move in this position is actually just d takes c3. And in fact, it pretty much forces a draw, because you don't really want to entertain f takes e3 and rook c2 check. That's extremely dangerous. So basically, after d takes a3, white would play queen takes g5 check. And now after king f8, queen h6 check, king g8, and queen g5 check, we pretty much repeat moves. Note that if I go to e8, let's say it takes, and king f8 check, and king e8 now, that probably wouldn't be a good idea, because there's queen h8 check, and then the rook on b7 the rook on c8 is a target. So, for instance, let's say queen h8 check, king d7, rook b7 check, I lose the rook and the game. Or maybe some lines actually knight e5 check is just as effective. So something I don't really want to get into. And I recognize that this was probably a line that would end in repetition, but I actually entertained more now, and so I took a little bit of a gamble here, not going for the most sensible line, and instead went for the move queen c6 check, because I recognized here that, the game would still be quite unclear, and white has to make a tough decision under fire. Note that a move like f3 all of a sudden, loses, because now after f3, I think I have queen c2 check, and I pick up the rook at the very least. And in fact, there might actually be more. I might have a mating idea here, because if king f1, I might actually throw in queen d1 check, and if king g2, rook c2 check. And this might actually be very dangerous as well. Note that if knight f2, I think queen e2 might actually be a problem. Although I'm looking now, maybe queen f5, queen takes g5 check is actually still a draw given this repetition. Point is that queen, however you slice it, queen c6 check is kind of a dangerous looking move, and blocking with f3 does not make too much sense. So it just forced White to think a little bit longer, and his time was ticking down. After 10-15 seconds thought, he actually played king g1, because again he was playing on increment. And now I actually played knight e4. And the idea with knight e4 now was that I actually cover queen takes g5 check, because now that's not possible. And in some lines, I entertain d takes c3 or even queen c2. It's not a good move, this knight e4. It's a real gamble. But I was just relying on my opponent's time trouble to kind of get me something here. And amazingly, after knight e4, e takes d4 was played, and here I got a little bit more excited, because I thought now the e-file is kind of opened up. Now, one of the things that I failed to kind of recognize until I got to this position is the knight on d3 is actually pretty well placed, entering, protecting the entry squares for black's heavy pieces on e1 and c1. So it's actually quite difficult for me to infiltrate, and that knight also covers the sensitive point f2. So there's actually no really effective way in right now. And because of that, I actually played the move rook a8. This move is not the best move in the position at all. In fact, this move gives White winning chances again. And if White actually, found rook b6, there would have been a totally different story, because actually after rook takes a5 and rook takes c6, this position all of a sudden is winning for White. But in fact, after this move rook a8, my opponent thought for a little while, and it turned out to be too long, because he actually flagged before making his next move, and I won the game on time. It was amazing thing to happen to me, and super fortunate, because my position really is in shambles if this move rook b6 is played, but he just did not make a move quick enough, and I was actually able to escape. And it was actually, I think, the first time this year that I actually won a game on time. And it's actually very, very rare that happens ever, especially when you're playing with increment, because you can always gain time. But I think he just got a little bit too engrossed in the position and had basically decision paralysis, if you will. So very, very fortunate. Now, in this position, instead of playing rook a8, if I played h4, the position is actually still kind of complicated, because if rook b6 now, I can go queen c7, and these pawn tensions here are still kind of annoying, and my queen is, close enough to the king to get some fight, and my knight on e4 is covering the important g5 square. So it wouldn't have been totally over, but after rook a8, rook b6, I would have been in really tough shape. So really happy to escape with the W. What can I say? In this one, my opening was definitely better. I definitely got a better position from the jump than in previous rounds, but I faltered in the middle game. I made some very poor decisions, panic decisions based upon pretty much nothing really, and it really nearly cost me. So it was fortunate to have like an extra life in this one, but I was going to have to play way better if I wanted to, do anything in this tournament. So, yeah. Anyways, That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.